So we're actually going to hand it over to our next presenter and workshop leader from a fabulous organization in Boston called the Network Lorette. If you don't know them, you should. And she will be doing a presentation on an introduction to the trans community. Shakira.
And all that network loving. Everybody else in here is like, so Network Cafe. Why is everyone so excited? So the Network Cafe is a Boston-based, though we work nationally, organization, survivor-led, dedicated to ending partner abuse in lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and/or trans communities. We also work with folks who identify as polyamorous or practicing consensual non-monogamy, and people who identify as part as kinky, BDSM, or SM communities. So people practicing consensual giving and receiving of power and/or intense stimulation. So I've heard words around the room all day about like dom and sub, and I'm like, ooh, let's talk about it. That's not what we're here for today, but if you want to have an SM presentation, call me. So like I said, yeah, the network works around partner abuse in our communities. We're a social justice organization. We're survivor-led and founded. We've been around for about 24, 25 years. So today, though, we're not going to talk about partner abuse, although I would love that as well. We're going to talk a little bit about trans communities. Although I think it's funny to sort of end the day with a 101 on trans communities because we've been talking about gender all day. But to ground us a little bit, I'm going to ask y'all to do an exercise. I feel so far away behind this, guys. With my little itty-bitty brainstorm. So I'm going to ask you to do an exercise, and I'm going to ask you to talk to the person next to you or around you about it. I want you to think about what is the earliest message you remember receiving about transgender or gender non-conforming people. So what is the earliest message? What age were you? What was that message that you heard about trans or gender non-conforming people? Who did you receive that message from? And then we'll talk about whether or not you think it was a positive, negative, or neutral message. So an example might be, or my example is that when I was 8 or 9, one Sunday after Mass, my mom and sister and I went out for breakfast in Old San Juan. I grew up in Puerto Rico. And there was a parade happening. I was 8, so I was like, glitter, rainbows, there's a parade. And interestingly enough, my mom was like super down with the parade, so we went to it. She explained to me it was the Gay Pride Parade. And so at first, I received a message that was kind of like, the gay scene is all right. We went to Sunday Mass, we had communion, we had breakfast, we're gonna go watch the gays march down the street, be happy. And I was like, okay. But the next message I received was the one where my mom and my sister ridiculed who at the time were maybe drag queens, they maybe were trans women, I don't know. But people performing femininity. And so the messages I then received was that that was excessive. That if these people wanted to be accepted, why did they have to wear their bodies this way, and why did they have to perform and dress up as butterflies and Miss Piggy? So my early message was that it's kind of okay to be gay, but you can't be those people who play with gender. And I would say that that was a negative message. So that's an example. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about your message, and then I'll ask you to just share it with the people around you. Positive, negative, or neutral?
Very negative.
I think for me the most vivid memory I have as a child was watching Jenny Jones in Maury with the shows. Is this a man or is this a woman making fun of trans people, and it made me sensationalize a very freak showish kind of depiction of trans people.
Do you remember about how early you can remember watching the Jenny Jones?
Jenny Jones, I don't know, probably 10 or 12.
Yeah. And did you say if it was positive, negative, or neutral?
Negative. But I also remember me myself participating as well. So I don't know, probably neutral.
Right.
Neutral, more negative.
Well, and I think this is one of the interesting things, right? We can look back and be like, at the time, maybe it was neutral because we were so young.
Yeah.
We were just collecting information. Looking back, I think we all have probably a really different analysis, hopefully, about what that meant. Yeah.
I actually remember, I think when I was maybe 11 or 12, going to a thrift store, and it was like a thrift store for a nonprofit, and with my mom, and the cashier was a trans woman, and I remember seeing her go through the transition of getting her breast augmentation. So over the course like a couple of years. And I actually described it as very positive, mainly because of like how my mom interacted with her, but also because other like straight men around her seemed to also, you know, like were attracted to her, and so it wasn't like she wasn't stigmatized in that setting.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah.
So I was probably about 12, and I loved Prince, and sort of my whole family. We all love Prince.
We all love
Exactly.
That's
But this proves my point. So I love Prince. Everyone in my family loved Prince. I loved his ass out and his pants. I loved his high heels. I loved everything about Prince. And so it was around the time he had gotten married and had a baby. And my uncle was like, y'all talking that crazy shit. He's a fairy. He probably had that baby. And for that, in that very first time, I was like, oh, is Prince a girl? But I remembered him talking so very negatively about the way that he was dressed, that for the first time in my life, I was like, wait a minute, have I been duped, right? Did Prince fool me? Did I think he was a boy when he was really a girl, like in the reverse the whole time?
Ooh.
So, but it was positive and negative because everyone in my family loved Prince. No one ever talked bad. No one ever had anything to say. Everybody loved him. It wasn't until Unc came through and kind of threw this doubt in about who was Prince that I was like, wow, do dudes really wear their ass out in pins?
Right. So we've got now the like 2 times we've heard the message of like, have I been duped? Is this a man or a woman? How do we know? Rosa?
So I grew up, when I was younger, my mom used to take me to Newmer, which was the New England Women's Music Festival, kind of like the Michigan Women's Festival. And I don't know how young I was. I think I must have been like 6, 7. But my mom explained to me that sometimes men would like pretend to be women and try and get into the festival. Like, so that's how it was for like, and it was just very much the women born women philosophy was presented to me, and that was kind of my first exposure to the idea of somebody being transgendered.
Who did you receive the messages from?
As my mom.
Mom. Positive, negative, or neutral?
Very negative.
Negative.
Yeah. But at the same time, butch women were fine.
Ah.
Yeah.
I was 11 in the 6th grade, and my Latin teacher, well, it was an all-girls school, so, you know, at the time, too, that was my first intro to, at the time it was GLBT, the acronym for gay, lesbian, etc. And so there was like safe spaces in GLBT written everywhere, but she happened to have a lot of them on like where her office space was. And and she was definitely a woman, and, you know, I knew it's Ms. Bloomberg, my Latin teacher, but at the same time she dressed men, like a man. So a masculine enough center woman. But of course I didn't have those names or anything at the time, so I'm just like, it was pretty neutral. It was like, all right, whatever, this is Ms. Bloomberg, you know. But at the same time, I think that's the first time I had a vocabulary or had a connotation for what that would look like in my life. Because previously I didn't really, Michael Jackson would have been like the only other like person before that, and I used to have all his music videos. I was born in '85, so like it was VSH tapes that I had. Like my mom bought me all his tapes, his music videos. But that before that, but definitely in my working life, like it was her.
And who did you receive the messages from?
I guess school. I mean, she was my teacher, so yeah, outside of Michael.
So, what was the experience like for folks sharing your messages, but also what are the reflections that are coming out of this exercise? What do you notice about any similarities, trends that come up?
Any ambiguity where it's not clear is not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we learned really early on that there are some really specific boxes, and we need to be able to place people in them firmly. Ambiguity, not okay. Anything in between, not okay. What else?
It seems to only be in reference to male to female. There doesn't seem to be a recognition of female to male in these discussions.
So a lot of early messages about trans women or trans femininity, but not the same, not as many around masculinity and trans masculinity. What else? Yeah.
When it's not sensationalized for us, when it's presented by the owner of the identity or the information, it's powerful and empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. So the distinction between the messages that are here from the media versus an actual interaction with a person and getting to know that person for who they are and part of their identity. What else do folks notice about these messages? What was it like to think back to these messages? Isa?
It's something about entertainment. When someone is objectified for our pleasure and entertainment, then okay, that's kind of cool. If not, then not so cool.
Right, yeah, a lot of this touches on the entertainment value. We don't quite as much get to the, like, if we can't make a joke of you, then there's violence, which we know is what really transphobia leads to. Other reflections? So some of the things that stand out to me also is that we receive these messages at an early age. And I'm sure if you were to like think back on this exercise a week or a month from now, you might actually be able to think of something earlier. We already had a lot of notions about gender by the time we were 10, 11, and 12. And now we're starting to know things about what it means to transgress those norms. Also that we get these messages from really important people in our lives. A lot of parents, moms, community, but also the school, media, right? So how much we're bombarded with these messages at this time where developmentally we're really trying to form our value system. And then overwhelmingly they are negative. Even the ones that maybe were neutral, some are actually realistically neutral, but a lot of them come with this negativity. So we do this exercise just to start, to make sure that we can all ground ourselves in the fact that we all have messages about what it means to transgress gender norms, and that we get them at an early age. And we may all be in different places around what we think about that, but that doesn't negate the idea that transphobia is very real, and that gender is like really strictly and staunchly policed in our society. Okay, moving on. So I want to do another brainstorm about what are the words that people use to describe their gender. All of them. How do we hear people talk about their own gender identity? Yeah.
Well, I just learned in the previous workshop I'm gender variant.
Gender variant?
I never had a word for it before. I'll just switching it up or something. Yeah, thank you.
And this is a time where I also want people to be able to ask questions about the words, or maybe say if you want to what it means for you. You don't have to. People can share as much or as little as they want. But I really love doing this exercise in community. What I didn't share before is that my role at the network now is technical assistance. So I go out into mainstream, read straight, cisgender, straight cisgender domestic violence organizations and teach them how to be nice to queer and trans folk. So when we do this exercise with them, they're like, huh? What? People talk about gender, huh? But when we do it in community, I mean, come on, the first word is gender variant. Okay. Also, I am writing this on the board on purpose, so let's go. Femme? Femme, yeah. Ooh. What else?
Gender queer.
Gender queer.
Boy, B-O-I.
Boy with an I?
Butch.
Androgynous.
Aggressive.
Good. So I want to pause. Is dyke a gender word or and a sexuality word?
Yes.
Yeah. Come on. Give me both.
Well, it depends on the person using it, like what they're trying to describe.
Could it be derogatory, perhaps? Can it? What do folks think?
Sissy?
Sissy? Do we hear folks use sissy to describe their own gender?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey,
Yep.
Butch queen.
Butch queen, yes. Oh, I hear the what's that. Okay. Let's check in. Point of information. What do we need clarification on so far?
Which queen? What does that mean?
Who wants to say what butch queen might mean for someone?
Masculine presentation on the outside, but more femme, more softer, more feminine personality on the inside.
Okay, that's one. Yes.
Soft stud.
Yes.
Yeah, they say soft stud.
Soft
I guess it depends on your geographic.
Butch queen is also that they are somewhat very emotive. Almost theatrically, so that it's more than just like, oh, I'm a woman who may present softly clothes-wise, but that, you know, it's almost as though what makes it comical is you're supposed to be a boy and you up here crying and acting up and, you know, bitching. It's like, oh, wait a minute, how does that happen? So that's my experience.
Also, butch queen.
So I'm gonna go over here and then I'll show Hope.
Sorry.
No, I just think that's interesting, like from a gay male perspective, a butch queen just means a gay man.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, a woman, a man.
Yeah.
Yes.
But so many of these words are for both men and women.
Yeah.
I mean, like, there's a lot of girls that are fags now. They're like, I'm a faggot, whatever. Or
Hope you had your hand
there
up.
are a lot of guys that are femme.
Yeah, I think I go Shamir, so I work at a community center where it's majority young men of color who identify as gay, and I've only heard butch queens used in reference to that, so work. I don't know.
Yeah.
So work.
Top and bottom. Top and bottom. Are those gender words or sexuality words?
Yes.
Yes. Y'all are playing with me. Yes, Shakira, they are. So wait, what did we just get? Top bottom, right? I know, you got a hand going, let's go.
Effeminate?
Do people use effeminate to identify their own? Like, have you heard someone say, I'm effeminate, that's my gender? Yeah? All right.
Come on, bitch.
That's your gender.
I got some laughter in the room. What's that laughter about? Huh? Oh, I heard that you said bitch. I did not hear you. I'm saying, why is everybody laughing?
Bitch is your
What's that
gender.
nervousness about? What's that? What just happened? So bitch, is that derogatory?
Is it a gender?
Depends on the person. Some people laugh at that. I'm proud. I'm a bitch. Depends on the person.
Have folks heard people use the word bitch to identify their own gender identity?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Masculine of center. I was like, we're missing some key words up here, I think. We have some really amazing words.
Can we say like male, female? Like,
No, we did not say those.
Wait, what?
Wait, so I would like to look at this list real quick. By gender. We just heard female and male. Why I'd like to echo that I love to do this presentation in community.
Lady.
What do people think about female and male? On the list, where we're talking about words people use to describe their gender identity.
Boring.
Boring. Isa, what's the
Governmental.
governmental? Isa.
Okay, I'm not gonna be crying and whining about it, but I need to go back to the bitch and be like, ouch.
Yeah,
That was my experience. That word as a woman, as a lesbian woman, whatever you want, that word has been used to rape, violate, put down, demean, and use and co-op aspects of femininity that are strong, that we as women can claim and have it be on something else. It doesn't feel like it even belongs up there in any real good analysis of gender. It's just fucked up in my opinion. I'm sorry.
Not real. That was around the word bitch.
Is this list supposed to be only positive words?
This is words people use to identify their own gender. So that's why I keep asking, have you heard people use this? Because what are the words we might, ouch, I always do that. Ouch. What words might be ouch up here?
Fag.
Sissy. Sissy was here.
Oh, the word dom didn't go up. Dom.
Effeminate.
Oh, right.
Effeminate, yeah.
Intersex is not up here. Have folks heard
Well, dom's
use
not
the word
necessarily.
intersex to describe describe their own gender identity?
I have heard, yes, I have actually.
Yes.
So what I would say about intersex,
But also, dom isn't necessarily the same as top. It depends on where you are geographically.
Yeah, there's different words.
it depends geographically, and it depends on somebody's experience of top or dom. So for some folks, top and bottom can simply, or not simply, that's rude. Top and bottom can be about position, it can be about power. Dom and sub can also be about power. For a lot of people, I agree that geographically, all of these words vary, and that's another point, right? Like, in New England, which is the one, I feel like aggressive is like just creeping up from the south, which I love. Love that. Coming from New York, coming from the south, AG, right? That's exactly what I was thinking. And we only have English words up here, right? We have matcha, mato, we have some different words up here. So it's going to vary geographically, it's going to vary by generation. I'm sure there's lots of folks in this room who are having very different reactions to different words. And I agree, top and bottom, dom and sub can mean different things, different communities, and for different people. So that's the other thing, a lot of these words are really individual. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that the title of this workshop is Trans 101, and we have a lot of different ways of playing with gender, but trans enter identity has not come up. What's up with that?
So trans man, trans
Okay.
woman,
Yeah.
FTM, MTF.
Oh yeah.
What was that?
Tranny.
Tranny? What do folks think about that word?
That's an ouchie word.
Because I'm like, I don't want to write that.
Well, I mean, you wrote bitch up there, so why can't you write tranny?
That's a great question.
And also transvestite.
Do you have transgender up there?
I don't. I'll put it up.
Yes.
Trans with a star.
Yeah. I love that.
What? The star?
And actually, who asked? Did someone ask if I have transgender or transgendered?
Transgender with ED.
With the ED. Okay. That's.
Break it down.
That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
What's trans with the star?
What's trans with the star?
No, speak on it. All trans.
Yeah. So for a lot of, I think, academic folks maybe, that might feel familiar. You know, you can put in that asterisk at a search engine and it'll fill in the blank for you. So if it's trans with the star, you sort of get to fill in the blank.
In a database.
It's a way of being more inclusive potentially.
I also think it's important to note that like some of the words like dyke and fag are okay to use sometimes within the community, but not, you know, like you may not want other people outside of the community.
Right, exactly. So tranny, fag, dyke, these are words that they're loaded, bitch. These are loaded words. If someone comes to me and calls me a dyke, we're gonna have a real problem. Also, because, oh yeah, mine isn't up here, hold on. I just got made. Just weird. Right, because it's real different if I'm hanging out with my girls and I'm like, ooh girl, I'm such a dyke today, I'm feeling it. I want to embody that, right? To have someone say it from the outside. I would say the same thing about tranny. That's why I was like, ooh, house. That word is loaded. And if someone self-identifies that way, that's one thing. But if there are folks who identify as cisgender.
What is cisgender? Because I've heard that today and I actually didn't.
Does someone want to give a definition of cisgender? I could, but.
It's when your gender and your presentation align, and essentially there's no dissonance, if you will, in the ways in which those are experienced and expressed.
Yeah, so, and I hesitate with presentation, because then it gets.
I said it on purpose.
Yeah, oh, thanks. Got it.
So is that more of an internal cisgender? Would that be an internal thing then? So if like, obviously I'm presenting feminine as a female, so if I'm cisgender, I feel like a male, or does it have to do with transgender in a way? Because what if I feel like I should have been born a male, but even though I'm presenting very feminine, or if I don't feel comfortable in my body, is
right,
that
so is it about presentation?
Is it about, yeah, like, I'm curious, I don't know if that is.
What do folks think? Hey, Juan, you had a hand up.
How I usually define it is whether your gender, identity, expression, gender, I guess matches your the sex that you were born with biologically. So I think it's important to say like what, And then so for a cis person, it's like, for instance, I identify as I would be a cis woman because I was born as a girl and identify as a woman. I don't know if there's a better definition, but usually I like to incorporate the biological sex.
I have a quick question too. So, I mean, I was a sociology major. So, in general, sociology teaches you, okay, well, race is made up, gender is made up. So, under that guise, but of course, I know that society, you need a label, you need words to explain things. But if it's made, like, you know what I mean? Like, we're all, humanity is one race. We're all like, you know, people. I don't know. Like, it's just like, but you need these words. So, when we think about transgender and educating people too, just on it, because even gay people within our communities don't necessarily have words for transgender or understand what's really going on when people want to transition. So
Right.
I'm just, yeah.
So cisgender refers to someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. That may or may not correlate with your sex. And that's why I also asked the question about intersex. Because intersex really refers to a broad range of conditions where somebody's biological sex, secondary sex characteristics like hormones, maybe it's a chromosomal thing going on, does not fit the medical model of what's normal. Which is funny, right? Because the medical model tells us like, they're boy bodies and they're girl bodies, and they look like this, and this is what happens. And in reality, nature gives us a whole lot more than that. Some people do identify intersex as a part of their identity, a lot don't. A lot identify it as a medical condition. And part of why we really include talking about intersex folks when we talk about trans communities is because intersex folks experience a lot of the same transphobia, violence, and medicalization, and medical violence against their bodies that trans people face. But for a lot of folks, it's not an identity. For some, it is. So again, we're just going to honor what people do, right? We're not going to be like, ooh, but that's not an identity. You can't do that. We'll get to say what they say. Cisgender means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth, as opposed to someone who's trans, who would identify their gender differently than the one they were assigned at birth, potentially. What was I going to say? I think I like to use cis because I don't like to identify people by what they're not. So I don't like to say trans people and non-trans people. That's for me a reason why I think it's important to identify cis and to talk about cis privilege and cis normativity, which basically says the world believes that you're born a certain way and you grow up that way and it all just sort of fits in, lines up, which it doesn't for a lot of people. Were there other words we still have questions on? Transvestite. People had questions about it. Slash, did cis make sense? Anonymous tone has fallen over the room. What's up?
Should we go through the differences between transgender, transsexual, transvestite, just for...
Okay. So, transgender. Who wants to give a definition? What we might mean when we say transgender? Male to female, female to male. Okay. Oh, I'm so short. I really like that word more, but okay, so trans, we might be talking about male to female or female to male. What else would folks add? I got my back to you, so just say it if you want to say it.
When I think of transgender, I actually think of people that's actually gone through a physical change, like actually reassigning their genders, as opposed to like a transvestite or something like that.
What were the words people wanted? Transgender, transvestite,
transsexual,
and transsexual.
And the ED
Oh, I guess transsexual.
Okay. So I would say, at the network at least, we would advocate to use transgender as an umbrella term to incorporate and encompass folks who transgress society's norms of gender. Might be folks who are F to M or M to F, female to male or male to female. Could be genderqueer folks. Or other people who identify as gender nonconforming. I would also urge us not to focus on surgeries in terms of someone's trans identity. And so we know that there's lots of reasons why someone might choose to or not choose to transition. What might those be?
Cost.
Financial. It is so expensive. Different parts of medical transition, hormone surgeries, Even social transition, buying a whole new wardrobe, getting binders or implants or bras, all of that costs money, right? So
Pleasure.
there's financial reasons, huh?
Pleasure.
Pleasure, what do you mean by that?
So, let's say a biological female transitions to male.
A biological female, so someone assigned female at birth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So F to M, and essentially is going to either have a penis created or not. There may be sensitivity loss, there may be, with relation to orgasm, pleasure, penetration, things of the sort, and that might not be necessarily needed.
Great. Why else might someone choose not to go through medical transition?
Safety.
Safety.
It's major surgery. There's risks that come along with that.
Absolutely, and overlapping health things, right? So this gave me an opportunity to talk about overlapping oppressions and identities. If someone's got some chronic illness stuff going on, having surgery might be extra risky. If someone's HIV positive, surgery's extra risky. So let's put that out there, right?
Also, the medical risks of taking different hormones, potentially.
Yep, so for some, the risk-benefit analysis about taking hormones, it could increase your risk for things like different cancers, etc. Hey, Juan.
Some people just don't want to.
Thank you. Absolutely. So some folks may not want to pursue medical interventions. Maybe they love their body the way it is. They transition in the way that feels good to them. So that's why I would definitely urge us to not focus trans identity and like some sort of marker of validity of someone's identity on surgeries. Because there's lots of reasons. What are some other ones?
I'm thinking reproduction when our kids, depending on how that works.
Absolutely. Which I would also say, let's me put a plug in about thinking about the language we use around reproduction, around babies, around how those things happen in a way that's trans inclusive. So if we talk about being breastfeeding, who does that leave out? Whereas we can use words like nursing, which might be more inclusive of people who don't refer to their chest as their breast, but might still be nursing their babies. So little things too, that's because we're real short on time. Also thinking about what are the ways that we can work to act against transphobia, especially in our own communities. So little things like saying nursing. If someone says breastfeeding and they're a trans person, great, let's call it breastfeeding. But if they feel left out by that, let's find language that makes it more inclusive. Let's advocate for reproductive rights of trans folks and gender non-conforming and gender-variant folks. Immigration status might be another one. Of course, because I do domestic violence work, violence and trauma might be another one. So I would say trans is as an umbrella term incorporating lots of folks, and that there isn't the need for medical markers, and that we never want to be asking people about their bodies or the surgeries they have or haven't had, or if they are or aren't on hormones, unless people want to share that information with us. What's about the ED, transgender? What do folks think? Especially in a room full of people of color. Because I often use colored as the way to talk about that, and whether or not that's an appropriate word. So what does the ED ending mean when we attach it to an identity?
Is it generalizing? I don't know. I'm like, when you said colored, that was out of that I'm trying to think of it in that from that context. I've never even heard of the ED on a transgender, so I don't know what. I don't have any clue. I'm just asking.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, it's an oppressive term.
It's an oppressive term. Why?
It's. I actually don't know. I just know it's wrong, unfortunately. So.
To me, when I hear transgender, it sounds like something that's happening to them without their choice. It's like this change is happening. I don't know. It's off. It's like almost the person has no what's the word I'm looking for? Agency.
Yeah.
Just ignorance and how to have conversations in regards to trans and what that means. So transgendered might be used to for someone who is naive about it and not meaning anything negative or oppressive about it. Just, oh, this person I know is transgendered, which means he or she went through the transition, unaware of how to, does not have the language to express what that may mean, so not understanding what the ED added to it does.
There was another hand up over on this side. So yeah, I would echo those points, right? That putting an ED ending often makes it sound like it's a verb or something that's happening to someone. Also that there's an idea that it's like, oh, transgendered, like you finished, as if there's a start and end to transness. which really there may or may not be. We could all be in different places at different times. So I would, again, advocate against using transgendered and think that as a community standard, most people would shy against it. Again, if someone uses that word for themselves, though, we're going to honor that, right? We're not going to tell people what their identity should be. Transsexual, I've heard used related to folks who identify with the medical process and having gone through some surgical transitions, but I also think that that's really culturally specific and context specific. In Puerto Rico, transgénero y transexual is the preferred community standard, and personas transexual get really upset if you leave that out. So, whereas my experience in like Boston is that people really prefer transgender. Some people identify as transsexual. There's different community standards. Transvestite more often refers to someone who takes on the clothing of a different gender as a performance. And so transvestite, drag, sometimes has more to do with the performance value of it than somebody's identity and how they experience their gender for themselves.
Transvestite, drag queen, same thing?
Not the same thing. But both people who perform gender. And I am not the only expert in this room, so if folks want to add things, please do.
Well, when I think of like transvestite, I think of more of like cross-dressing, where it's in your everyday life that you might want to wear the clothing of another gender, but for whatever reason, not wholly take on that other gender.
Yeah. So folks who cross-dress, again, might be related, often thought of related to pleasure, the pleasure of putting on other clothes, but not the same as someone who experiences their gender identity in that way. Again, these are all really fluid terms that are moving, right? And so it's useful to have common knowledge of words and think about which words are or aren't respectful, and recognize that there's lots of moving parts and none of these boxes are firm. What's that?
I just wanted to say something about the way you've been talking about transgender. I have a friend who's identifies as male, and he said, well, yes, I march with the trans people, but I don't feel like I'm trans because I just feel like I was male when I was born, and I haven't changed. Like, I'm not transitioning to anything. Like,
Yeah.
This is just me.
Absolutely, and so for some people, saying that they're a trans man or a trans woman or a transgender man or a transgender woman is a really important and powerful thing that needs to be recognized. For some people, that is a big disrespect. To be like, oh, you're a trans woman. They're like, no, I'm a woman. Punto, period, end of that sentence. Some people want to identify as a man with trans experience. And so being really honoring of what people identify, and again, not coming as like cis folks, for me, as a cis person, and being like, oh, I know all about transies. I'm going to put all these labels on you. But having that open-ended conversation. Which moves me to, how does transphobia come up in our communities?
You mean gay and lesbian communities? Or
In the
just in general?
GLBQ.
Oh, okay.
In the gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer community. Especially, because I think we don't talk about this enough. It's real easy to talk about it from outside our own communities. Let's talk about our own stuff. How does it come up?
Discomfort?
What do you mean?
I think a lot of times we just look at like the people in the room could be LGB, and therefore if there's no transgendered person, it doesn't really, it's not practically applied or practically done.
So are you also talking about the like adding on of the T? Like, oh, we're going to say GLBT, but we don't actually mean that. We're just putting on the T because we know we're supposed to.
I didn't think of it that way, but I understand.
Okay.
A lot of gay and lesbian people, they just don't understand why is the team there. I'm not like that. Why they adding on to us? And that gives them an excuse to discriminate against them, which is so wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So not seeing why our struggles are actually linked. Also not recognizing the distinctions, right? Gender and sexuality are important pieces of our identity that may be connected, but are not in and of themselves the same thing. That's part of why you'll see at the network that we use LGBTQT/T. It's because we've made a conscious decision that we want to be able to have a way to talk about the distinction between gender identity and sexuality, and just putting Q and or T allows us to do that. And we know that there's lots of different ways people put the acronym up. What are some other ways that we see transphobia in our own communities?
It's sometimes like seen as like a betrayal, like if a female were to transition to male, like abandoning like womanhood.
What can we do to combat it? Maybe let's talk about what's the transphobic thing that we see, and what can we do to counteract it?
Well, I was just gonna mention the example that I think her name was Mia. She was on the gender panel.
Yeah.
The Michigan Women's Festival, they don't allow trans women to participate, or male to female people to participate. And in our community, there's sometimes an exclusion that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. And so if it's a woman-only space, is the assumption that that means women-born women? And what does that mean about trans women? Trans women were born women. They were assigned little baby boy.
Yeah.
Maybe. But they're women. Born women, right? And how do we, if we actually want to be trans allies, speak up against that?
I honestly, well, to say too, it's miseducation or not education. Like, there's no knowledge of it. Like, I didn't understand trans until I was in college, actively taking these sociology or queer studies classes to have even an idea to say, well, wait, because I'm sitting in a privilege of everything matching up for me. But what if it didn't? And I have friends that it doesn't, but they don't even have the access to even begin to think of transitioning. But it's like, I just, we have to understand that in itself, it's energy. I mean, really, because even being gay, I speak about this all the time. Personally, for me, it doesn't have to apply for everyone. But honestly, gay in itself is not necessarily the sex. It's not the sex. It's the wanting of a partner that is a woman. It's not really sexual, and that's why we get all this crap. Because if people think of it as sex, oh, you're sexually derivative or whatever, the whole thing. I don't know, but
right.
it's like
there's also a simple implication of sexuality. I would say again, let's talk about sexuality, not just sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Sexuality, we use a 3D model, right? So we talk about sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, not just sex.
Yes.
Behavior, what you do, who you date, who you fuck, who you want to flirt with, who you have an online whatever with. That's the Then there's the identity, what we call ourselves. And all of those three things, if you see one of them, doesn't tell you the whole picture. But when we say sexual orientation, I think that limits all of us.
Yes.
As opposed to talking about our sexuality as a much broader thing. And honoring that there's a difference between gender identity, sexuality, and that they're all connected, and having conversations that include all of it. And seeking out the education as lesbian, gay, bi, and queer folks about trans and gender nonconforming communities and allying ourselves with folks.
I think sometimes when we are choosing our partners, that in itself can be looked at as transphobic. I know in conversations I've had with people who identify as lesbians say, I will never date someone who identifies as a trans woman, or someone who's a trans man, and identifies as a trans man says, I will never date someone, or a gay man will never date a trans man. And that in itself is looked at as transphobic. I don't know if that is, but I definitely have heard it in conversations.
Right, and I'm going to guess for some it is and for some it's not, right? Where's that line between like I'm attracted to some folks and I'm not attracted to some other folks? That's all right. But where is that fetishizing and or denying the relationships with trans and gender nonconforming folks? And how do we begin to have conversations that say, maybe that's fucked up, maybe it's not, but let's talk about it as opposed to being like, oh, okay, the story.
I was going to say another layer of, to add on to betrayal, is kind of like the perceived allegiance or lack thereof when anyone transitions and then identifies as heterosexual.
Yep.
I think that's a whole different type of betrayal, and that is associated with transphobia. And then there's also, I think, the stigma around there being definite like mental health issues and or concerns if someone is transitioning. So I think mental health is its own whole different conversation. But
can you say more about what you mean with that?
I think a lot of folks, and maybe stereotype or have been ill-informed that if you are transitioning or have transitioned or identify as trans, in whatever way that it's like something wrong with you mentally. And so the same way that if you are depressed and would take a, I don't know, like Zoloft, I don't know if that's even for depression, but some pill that you would take for depression, you could basically take T or take estrogen to basically solve the same mental problem that you have, which is the real reason that you're trans.
Yeah, and so how ableism interacts with our identities, right? And this idea that, one, if you're trans and or want to transition somehow, then you must be mentally unstable, but also the idea that we can't talk about that in our communities, or that mental health stuff is like always a bad thing. So I think there's like a yes and for me where I'm like, yep, let's talk about the fact that trans people are not sick in the head somehow at all. Neither are queer people, and up until 20 years ago, being a homosexual meant you were a psychopath. Then it was a DSM-4, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual disorder.
When did they take it off the DSM? Was it 83?
73.
73. It was 73. That's why I thought it would be. Okay, 73.
I mean, we can all be crazy though. Let's just put
No, it's not.
I would say let's check ourselves on the use of ableist language. I think we talk a lot about privilege and oppression, and ableism is often left behind. And I don't mean just about physical ability, but I mean about cognitive and mental health stuff. So I want to put a check out there and be like, ouch, crazy has gotten thrown around a lot today.
I apologize. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's see, have someone not spoken about transphobia in our communities, how it comes up, and what we can do to act against it? Who hasn't spoken yet?
There's actually a situation on an international group about this because there's a move towards getting more lesbian/women space at this conference, and the concern is trans women wanting a part in that and how that'll play out. Because there's definite groups that are like, oh no, never, like Michigan Women's Festival level, and others who are less opposed but see things both sides. And I'm just wondering how to bring the conversation to a less divisive place, if that's possible. One of the arguments is that there is a lot of trans space in this particular entity, but we're always about defining for ourselves and going where you're comfortable, and so how do you balance the two?
What are folks saying? How do we work around trans inclusion and fighting transphobia when there's this women's only space conversation? It's powerful, it's important. We're not saying women's spaces are not important and meaningful and necessary. No one wants to go there.
I think nobody wants to go there because for me, I did vagina monologues, and our space was sort of women only, born women, or like that's what the organization perceived at the university that I was working at. That's what everybody understood, and it was very hard for us to get trans people involved. And it's helping, I think, doing outreach in a way that helps trans people understand like you are included in this space. Like this type of language isn't like derogatory language isn't accepted here. We're gonna make sure that like you can use whatever bathroom you want to use and so forth and so on to make sure that this person feels comfortable. And I think that's kind of the work that you have to do. Not just saying, okay, so we're just gonna drop this whole women born women label off, but what else do you need to do in that space to make sure that this is accessible to the transgender people you want to have in the space?
Right. And that watering it down is not necessarily the goal here, right? We're not like, oh, well, let's de-gender everything. We're not talking about, this is why people react so strongly to the gender neutral stuff. We're talking about gender inclusive. And so we're saying women, this is a woman's space, we mean all women and anybody who identifies as a woman. That's a way of using language that says we're being inclusive, as opposed to saying women and being like, well, trans women should know they're allowed here. That's a difference. Making bathrooms accessible, basic, and really important. And what do we do when we're in spaces where there's gendered bathrooms and we can't make them suddenly not gendered? I would argue, advocate with the institution you're at to be able to put up signs that say, this is a women's restroom, this is for anybody who identifies as a woman, let people choose the bathrooms they choose, it is not your job to tell people where to go to the bathroom. And we do have templates at the network for signs that you can put up, or if you can, for the day, like, it would have been nice if I was here, and when I went to those restrooms, there was signs over the woman and men sign that just said all gendered bathrooms, or that said, this is a bathroom for women, all women. This is a bathroom for men, all men. It's not your job to tell people what bathroom to use, let people use the bathroom they identify with. Right? Like, I don't really have to think about it because I'm a cis person and I have the privilege to walk into a bathroom safely. But that could have been a little thing that we do to create a more trans inclusive space. What else can we do?
The education about the language, because what if you say something you don't even know it's offensive because it's ignorance, it's real. Like if I don't know, how can I not hurt people if I just don't know? So it's just the fact of education, I say, like, it's not just, it's education, I feel.
Yeah, I would say seek out the self-education, because there's a lot of information out there, y'all, like, I don't know. You can all have reactions to this. I'm having an internal reaction before I even say it, but like, wiki it. There's a whole lot of Trans 101 on the interwebs. If we have the interwebs accessible, do that. But also have conversations and be okay to make mistakes, right? The oops concept, I agree, it's really helpful for workshops, but I think you can also find ways to incorporate it into our lives as a principle and as a value. That says, be willing to tell people, like, ooh, dang, you just said that and that wasn't all right. That stuff. And that works when we're coming from loving places and that people know that. When we're coming from the relational place. This isn't about attacking and knocking down people. This is about building our communities.
So how do you, I mean, I don't know what your advice would be, and I apologize if this is not where you're ready to go, but how do you, I guess, honor where you are in your life and your walk as a, as someone born in one sex and raised as that sex, regardless of your gender, without, like, celebrate that without excluding? So if you have whatever the fill in the blank is, and you say only women born women space, how do you celebrate that space and want to celebrate those experiences that are, whatever they may be, that are women born women, without, you know what I mean, like without excluding people? Because I feel like we're discussing a lot, but I think that in these types of conversations, I often feel like we tiptoe around real feelings, and sometimes it's important for us to feel like, okay, as a lesbian, I want to go to a conference and there be all lesbians, right? And if lesbian to you means women born women who choose to sleep with women, period, then, obviously that's not what this particular conversation, I'm just using it as an example, but like, how do you celebrate whatever your identity is, and other people that also use that same, that have that same identity without excluding and offending? I feel like we get to the point where it's like, I'm tiptoeing to the point that it's like, you know what, fuck it, I'm not even gonna step anywhere anymore because I can't do it without hurting someone's feelings.
Right. My two thoughts, and people can add to this, are solidarity and the fact that ally is a verb. So I would say, all right, people want to have a space that's like, this is for people assigned women and who identify as women, for cis women. Great, let's do that. But then I want to see those cis women show up and help, like, be volunteers in a space for trans women. Like, I want y'all to, like, set up the room and create space for trans women to be like, this is just for trans women then. So how do we actively do solidarity work that says, let's celebrate this space and build it and create it, and then I'm going to show up, and I'm going to support you building and creating this space. And then hopefully we'll have a space where we can all come together and talk about where our overlap is. So I would say thinking about what solidarity means and knowing that it's the whole, like, my liberation is tied to your liberation is tied to their liberation, and that if you're an actual trans ally, right, folks will know that. And I mean, some people will and some people won't. It's not like we get to walk around and be like, ooh, here's my Girl Scout vest. Right. I got my badges. Here's my trans ally badge. So someone's going to see me and I'm going to say something and mess up, and someone's going to be like, oh, she nasty. And I'm going to have to deal with that. And also that ally is a verb, right? So that it'll mean a different thing for different people, and that it's an active process. We don't get to just claim that and be like, I wear my sticker. So I would say thinking about doing solidarity work and really building cross-movement. And so if trans folks want to rally and they want people to show up in front of the State House, if I want to celebrate that women-only space, then I also got to show up at the State House to support trans rights. Last couple thoughts about trans inclusion and fighting transphobia in our communities. Yeah.
I would say advocate.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes up is like homelessness, the inability to have adequate housing or get an education, to get a job. So helping those who can't advocate for themselves to get these things.
Yep. So advocating, using our privilege for cis-identified folks to show up and fight for these really basic rights like safety and jobs. And also knowing when it's our job as a privileged people, shut up. So when to use our voice and our power and privilege and when to check in.
I just had another thing as far as transphobia, and I can literally think of someone who is like, okay, well, it's all right to be gay because, you know, that's real, that's valid, we're born gay. But to deny the body you're born into and to want to alter that, you know, it's like that takes it to a whole nother level. And that's when you said, like, the intersection of sexual orientation, sexuality, like, energies and all that, because it's a bigger thing to be like, okay, well, I'm gay, yeah, I'm in this body, and I'm loving same gay, same gender people, but to take away, to want to take away the body God gave you, you know, quote unquote, you know, like, that's a whole nother ball game, and how that, I think that's where the genuine issues stem from, because it's like you know, but then it's an education piece of understanding what's within that body and that spirit and that mind doesn't align with the body that you were given by God, you know. So it's like,
and then to be allies is to sometimes be the people who take up those conversations and sit down with someone and say, yeah, I hear that you are tied to the body, and I hear that that's your experience, but let's talk about my trans brothers and sisters who are having these experiences, so that it's not always trans people having to have that conversation. Yeah, I was back to the advocate piece, just thinking about that, like, white, middle-class, male-dominated, gay, lesbian, bi movement. Woohoo, DOMA, woohoo, don't ask, don't tell. DOMA, don't ask, don't tell, still leaving out lots of trans and gender non-conforming folks. Still not really meeting the needs of us, like, POC communities who can't get jobs. Trans women of color who are experiencing higher rates of violence than anybody else in our communities. Let's have those conversations and name those things. I'm probably out of time. So thank you all for